Welcome to Boring History Podcast. This time we're talking about medieval sex. You've made it to a quiet little corner of the internet. I'm really glad you're here. Take a slow, gentle breath and let your eyes start to soften. There's nothing you need to do right now, nothing to fix, nothing to chase. This moment is just for you. You are safe here exactly as you are. Let the world outside fade away for a while. Let your mind fleet freely as we quietly wander through the past together like pages turning in a book you don't need to finish. And if this feels like a nice place to rest, you're welcome to like and subscribe, only if it feels right in your heart. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. I think that's a beautiful thing to share. As we gently begin our exploration today, we're going to lay the foundation by truly understanding how medieval culture and even their unique perceptions of the human body profoundly influence their views on something as fundamental and universal as sex. How medieval culture and our brains shaped views on sex. It's quite fascinating, really. You know, when you consider how people back then in the medieval world, they certainly recognized sex as, well, a natural urge, something pleasurable.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't naive about the physical side of it.
But they interpreted that whole experience through this lens that was just so distinctly shaped by their religion, their medical ideas, which were, let's say, evolving, and even all the folklore floating around.
Exactly. They knew it felt good, but that feeling was immediately filtered through a worldview that can seem, well, pretty alien to us now.
Right. So let's talk about those medical explanations for desire. They seem pretty key.
They really were.
Yeah.
They were deeply rooted in the ancient humor theory. You know, the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm.
That old chestnut.
Yeah, and it was the accepted framework. The idea was that imbalances in these humors were responsible for, well, basically everything: your mood, your health, and your libido.
So if someone felt unusually horny,
A medieval physician might look at something totally seemingly unrelated, like, did you eat too much rich food? Are you getting enough exercise? Things that were believed to upset that delicate humoral balance, you see. And that imbalance was thought to amplify desire.
and this directly impacted, say, monks.
Definitely. You see Christian reformers encouraging fasting, simple diets. The thinking was that rich foods could cause, well, wild sex dreams and nightly emissions. So keep the diet plain, keep the libido in check.
But here's where it gets kind of counterintuitive, right? Because physicians, using that same humor theory, actually sometimes encouraged married couples to have sex.
Yes, not just for babies, but for their health.
Oh.
The belief was it expelled this built-up seed, and they thought both men and women produced this seed, by the way.
Okay.
And expelling it kept the humors balanced, which prevented illness.
Yeah.
It was seen as like a necessary release.
Wait, so doctors prescribed, well, not prescribed, but suggested masturbation. That's kind of wild considering the church's views.
They did, yeah. Or herbal potions, things like thyme or water lily. If marital sex wasn't available, maybe a spouse was away, or religious vows. These were seen as alternative ways to release that seed and stay healthy. It definitely feels very different from the official church line.
It creates this constant tension, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Medieval people would blame feeling overly horny on anything from these humoral imbalances, sort of a basic biological idea, to, well, outright demonic influence.
Wow, quite the range.
But underneath all that, there was this sort of pragmatic acceptance. Sex was just part of life, a natural force they had to figure out how to manage.
But despite that kind of baseline acceptance, there was also this pervasive sense of shame, fear, and guilt wrapped around sex.
Oh, deeply woven into the fabric of life. The church's teachings, especially from major figures like Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, really hammered home the sinfulness of sexual pleasure, particularly if it wasn't just about making babies.
Lust itself was seen as bad.
Fundamentally bad, linked right back to Eve and original sin. It was seen as a root of evil, which led to this widespread shame about your own body, your own desires.
Can you imagine feeling that constant tug of war between what your body is telling you and what, society and the church are demanding?
It must have created such a complex internal conflict, this tension between just being human and this omnipresent message of sin.
And you see it play out in weird ways, right? People acting pious in public.
Right, publicly trembling at fiery sermons about sin, but then secretly they're telling dirty jokes or doodling pretty explicit stuff in the margins of manuscripts, even religious ones sometimes.
No way. Penises in Bibles.
It happened. It shows that contrast, that internal struggle, and maybe a little bit of subtle defiance.
And all that secrecy, that forbidden nature of talking openly about sex, that probably made it even more, alluring. Mysterious.
Paradoxically, yes. Sex wasn't dinner table conversation. It was whispers between close friends, maybe, or just absent from polite literature altogether.
But people still had questions. They still needed practical information.
Exactly. And that need led to these surprisingly detailed descriptions popping up in, of all places, medical texts and confession manuals. People needed to know about their bodies, about reproduction, and priests.
Yeah.
They needed really precise definitions of sins to figure out the right penance. So confessors often had to ask for, well, quite explicit details.
That practical need kind of forced a strange sort of candor in these otherwise very formal texts.
It did. And like you said, that defiance sometimes bubbled up in art. The graffiti, those marginal doodles, they're clear signs of people pushing back, finding private, often funny ways to express what was officially repressed.
And when they couldn't explain their own desires.
They often turned to external forces, demons, magic, succubi, incubi, these demonic beings thought to visit people in their sleep, cause erotic dreams, even impregnate women. It was a convenient way to explain urges that felt overwhelming or forbidden in a world constantly saying no. It let private fantasies run a bit wild, filled with bedroom tales and rumored demonic encounters.
So it's really clear, isn't it? These medieval beliefs about the body, the humors, religion, they profoundly shaped how sex was seen. A real mix of like medical pragmatism and deep spiritual worry. Okay, let's dig into how medicine and religion tried to reconcile pleasure with this constant idea of punishment. It seems they came up with some pretty peculiar methods.
It's fascinating because different authorities had different takes.
Yeah.
You had physicians, especially from respected schools like Salerno, saying sex within marriage was actually okay, even medically necessary. Good for expelling fluids, balancing those humors.
Right, the health angle again.
But the official church line, much stricter. Any pleasure that wasn't strictly, absolutely necessary for making a baby, sinful, period.
And people just found ways around that.
They got creative. A key thing here is the Galenic two-seed theory. This was a big medical idea back then.
Both men and women have seed.
Yes, and crucially, they believed both needed to orgasm for conception to actually happen.
Ah, so that creates a loophole.
A strange one, yeah. Suddenly, sexual pleasure, especially female orgasm, becomes medically necessary.
But only for making babies.
Exactly. You can enjoy it, technically, but only if the end goal was procreation.
So theologians like Augustine and Aquinas were pretty rigid on this. Aquinas saying enjoying it with your wife was like using a prostitute.
Right.
That's harsh.
Extremely. But others introduced some nuance. Albertus Magnus, a really important theologian, he pointed out that if a wife didn't orgasm, her retained seed could actually make her sick.
So another medical justification almost by accident.
Pretty much. It provided a reason for female pleasure within marriage, even if the main driver was still conception and avoiding illness, not enjoyment for its own sake.
So imagine you're living back then. Your doctor says sex is healthy, keeps the humors balanced. Your priest says pleasure is a sin unless it's just for babies. What do you even do?
It really shows how individuals had to navigate these completely contradictory messages, find their own way through it all.
Okay, but what did they think caused desire in the first place? Where did that urge come from in their minds?
It was a real blend, part rudimentary science, part supernatural explanations.
The science part being.
Humors again. They thought too much heat or dryness in the brain, or in the testicles for men, could activate the sex drive.
So testicle temperature mattered.
Apparently. Warm and moist testicles meant eagerness, potency, dry or hot ones, problems, impotence maybe. And this tied into diet too. Hot spices were thought to boost libido. Cooling herbs like mint or rue could calm it down.
But just when you think it's all bodily fluids.
Bam, religion jumps back in. Demons, sin, succubi and incubi stealing semen, infesting dreams, causing unnatural urges or impotence.
Wow. And even darker beliefs.
Yeah, like women getting pregnant without a husband might have made demonic pacts. And though it was fading a bit, that old idea of the wandering womb still lingered. For some doctors blaming strange desires or illnesses on the uterus literally moving around inside the body.
Plus folklore blaming things on evil spirits.
Right. So a real mix of biology, demons, and wandering organs.
Let's pause and look at where we are. We've seen how these deeply ingrained medieval beliefs about the body, humors, religion really shaped everything, even the most private parts of life. Sex was clearly this complex force, viewed with both a kind of medical pragmatism and this really profound spiritual worry.
Quick flashcard mode, reflecting on what stood out to me from this first dive. Medieval doctors often advised sex for health, thanks to humor theory. But the church saw pleasure as sinful, especially if not for making babies, causing a lot of internal conflict. The fact that talking about sex was forbidden actually made it more alluring, leading to secret erotic art and doodles, that Galenic two-seed theory. It gave a weird medical loophole for female orgasm, linking it to conception and sexual desire itself. They blamed it on everything from bodily humors to demons.
Now, let's really delve into the powerful role of religion, particularly the Christian church. How did it define, restrict, and sometimes even, well, justify sexual behavior back then? This is where we find some of the most rigid and honestly sometimes bizarre rules. Hashtag tag tag 2. Religion and sex in the Middle Ages.
The official church stance was remarkably clear-cut, at least on paper. Sexual activity was good only within marriage and solely for procreation. Anything else, condemned.
So just one permitted act.
Essentially, yes. Penis and vagina intercourse between a married man and woman with the conscious, explicit intention of having a baby. That was it.
And everything else, oral, anal, masturbation.
Strictly forbidden. All lumped together under labels like contrary to nature or the broad term sodomy.
Even the position mattered.
Oh, yes. Medieval clerics taught the missionary position was the proper way. Man over woman. They thought a woman on top could somehow dry up the man's seed and stop conception. It sounds odd to us, but that was the belief.
And the forbidden days, that sounds like a lot of scheduling.
It really was. You had holy days,
Yeah.
every Friday, all of Lent, plus any time the wife was considered unclean, menstruating, pregnant, or recently having given birth. A couple could face, significant stretches of time where sex was mandated off limits.
The overall message seems pretty stark then.
Very. Make babies only when you absolutely have to and don't enjoy it too much while you're at it. That was basically the church's takeaway. Wow, so they really had a schedule for intimacy, even for married couples.
That's
Oddly logical in a strict sense.
so for Christians, married sex for babies was the only good act.
Right. Adultery, fornication, sex with anyone else, mortal sins. And again, any non-procreative acts, even within marriage, got grouped under that sodomy umbrella.
Including during those unclean periods.
Absolutely. They cited biblical references about menstruation being unclean and had medieval medical ideas about sex during pregnancy potentially harming the fetus. This could mean months of required abstinence for a married couple.
But did people actually follow all these rules?
In practice, often not. We see evidence that couples ignored many restrictions. They might even use pregnancy or menstruation as a convenient excuse to avoid the official kind of sex and maybe engage in other acts that were forbidden anyway, or just wait it out.
Imagine a medieval calendar, not just marking feast days, but also Xing out dozens, maybe hundreds of days a year when even married sex was off limits. The pressure that must have created.
It really highlights that human tendency to find workarounds when rules feel too rigid.
And confession became a big part of managing this, right?
Huge. By the 13th century, mandatory confession was implemented. This created a system for the church to monitor and address all these potential sexual sins.
And they had manuals for it.
Incredibly detailed penitential manuals. They listed literally every imaginable sexual practice and prescribed the exact penance for each. Masturbation, for example, might get you 30 days of fasting, maybe more.
Wow. And they got really specific.
Unbelievably so. Berchard of Worms' manual from the 10th century had priests asking women point blank if they'd used a dildo, they called it a machina, for fornication with other women.
That's explicit. And adultery penalties.
Severe.
Yeah.
Years of penance, sometimes even excommunication. Public penances, too. There's an Irish canon saying an adulterous man couldn't sleep in the same bed as his wife for a whole year as part of his penance.
All that focus on confession must have created a constant weight of guilt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even normal marital sex became a potential moral trap if it happened at the wrong time or in the wrong way, or, heaven forbid, was enjoyed too much.
But the church didn't condemn all sex as evil, did it?
No, not inherently. They recognized its necessity within marriage, but primarily as a duty to God for procreation.
Not for enjoyment.
Pleasure itself was deeply suspect. Augustine, as we mentioned, even saw marital sex as a kind of penance for Adam's fall, something to be done almost reluctantly.
And Aquinas comparing pleasure seeking with your wife to prostitution.
Right. Though countering that, you had theologians like Albertus Magnus bringing in that medical idea if the wife didn't orgasm, her retained seed could cause illness. It subtly forced a recognition that female pleasure had some importance, even if just medically necessary for conception or health.
So the bottom line for marriage was
Permitted, even required, but only in the prescribed way, not too often, and anything beyond that demanded confession and penance.
And outside of marriage, the ideal was total abstinence, celibacy.
Celibacy was held up as the absolute pinnacle of spiritual purity. Priests, monks, nuns, they all took vows of total abstinence. An unmarried life was seen as theoretically superior, free from temptation.
Virginity over motherhood.
In terms of holiness, yes. Virgin saints like the Virgin Mary were celebrated precisely for their chastity. Monks and nuns were meant to be the living examples of how to conquer natural urges, embodying the purest state.
And if you broke the rules, the punishments could be pretty harsh.
Definitely. Beyond these spiritual penances, fasting, pilgrimages, wearing rough hair shirts, there was public humiliation.
Like the Scarlet A.
Exactly. Or being forced to sit on a feces-covered bench, essentially a medieval pillory. For really severe cases labeled sodomy, you could be excommunicated or even handed over to secular courts for much harsher penalties.
Like death or mutilation.
A council in 12th century London did advocate for those extreme penalties for sodomy, yes, but the church itself rarely carried out executions directly. It was more about public shaming and spiritual correction usually. If you were caught, do you remember some of the forms of public shaming you might endure? The Scarlet A is one, but there were even more degrading options.
Now, was it all just official church doctrine, or did local customs play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Folk religion and older pagan remnants often existed side by side with Christian teachings. You'd see contrasting practices.
Like maypole dancing.
Exactly. Or carnival mischief, fertility charms, things that often flew in the face of Christian restraint. Peasants might celebrate spring festivals with quite obvious phallic symbols and sing bawdy songs, completely ignoring the church's norms about modesty.
So people might trust the local midwife over the priest sometimes.
In rural areas, definitely. They might rely on traditional charms or advice from the midwife about sex and fertility rather than listening to sermons. But this is important. If someone was actually caught breaking the rules, official church law usually won out in court, even if those secret village traditions continued underground. So far, we've seen how pervasive the church's influence was, attempting to regulate nearly every aspect of sexual life, but also how human nature found ways to adapt, both openly and in secret. It was a really elaborate dance between piety and practicality.
Here's what stuck with me from this chapter, like looking at quick flashcards. Christian doctrine really limited sex to just procreative marital acts, condemning pretty much everything else. Those confession manuals were incredibly detailed, even asking about dildos. Pleasure itself was suspect. Some theologians even basically equated marital pleasure with paying for a prostitute. Yikes. Celibacy was glorified as the ideal, even though, as we'll see, many clergy didn't exactly practice it. Punishments included really intense public shaming, like wearing that Scarlet A, and folk traditions often openly celebrated fertility, creating a sharp contrast with the church's rules. Okay, now let's peel back those layers even further. Let's step right into the homes, the barns, the fields of the ordinary medieval person. What did intimacy really look like for them away from the castles and the complex theology? This is where things get, well, very real and sometimes surprisingly intimate. ###3, everyday sex lives of commoners.
Well, for common folk, the general expectation was definitely to wait until marriage before having sex. That was the social norm, deeply ingrained.
And marriage happened young, right?
Often very young. Soon after puberty, typically. Around age 12 for girls, maybe 14 for boys. And these weren't usually love matches.
Arranged deals, mostly.
Exactly. Arranged by parents for economic reasons, social stability, land, not romance. But once they were married, couples were absolutely expected to have regular sex.
Primarily to have kids.
Crucially, yes. Producing heirs was vital, especially with such tragically high rates of infant and child mortality back then. You needed lots of children just for a few to survive.
But those church restrictions we talked about, the forbidden days, the unclean times, that must have made things complicated.
Hugely complicated, practically speaking. If you add up all the holy days, Fridays, Lent, plus times of menstruation, pregnancy, post-childbirth recovery, you're left with only a handful of legal days for sex each month.
One handbook said less than once a week on average. That's definitely not what you picture when you think about medieval life. It's such a stark reminder of all the rules they lived under.
It really is. But again, reality often diverged. Peasants, especially, frequently ignored these taboos. Pragmatism often won out. They'd have sex in the barn, maybe after church, whenever the opportunity rose, rather than meticulously waiting for an official window.
And finding that opportunity must have been hard, given the lack of privacy.
Oh, incredibly hard. That's one of the starkest realities. Think about medieval homes, often just one room.
Everyone sleeping together?
Entire families, sometimes even guests or travelers, all sleeping in a single large bed, or maybe just on straw spread on the floor. Even early medieval lords often slept in their great halls, surrounded by retainers and family.
So no private bedrooms for most people.
Not for commoners, no. Later on, nobles started getting separate solar chambers, maybe curtains around the bed for a bit of privacy, but that was a luxury.
So ordinary folks just managed.
They had to. Intimacy happened in those communal beds, maybe in a hayloft, or literally out in the fields or woods. Even, as the saying went, with grandma at the foot of the bed.
Wow. So if a peasant couple needed a moment alone,
They'd have to sneak off. Slip out to the barn, find a secluded hedgerow, maybe the stable, anywhere they could grab a few minutes of seclusion. Imagine the sounds, the smells, the sheer closeness of a medieval peasant home. How would you find a moment for yourselves? It really speaks to their resourcefulness.
and the sex itself between spouses, mostly seen as a duty.
Primarily, yes, a normal part of married life. Women understood it was about having babies. Men saw it as part of their husbandly role.
Was pleasure acknowledged at all?
Grudgingly, perhaps. Remember Aquinas saying only Christ loved his bride to be loved back, implying humans just used marriage for kids? That reflects the general attitude.
But didn't some manuals mention foreplay?
Yes, interestingly, some did. There's advice for husbands to engage in quite extensive foreplay caressing, kissing to heat up the wife, supposedly waiting for her signal of readiness, like babbling, they called it.
Babbling, okay. So some awareness of female arousal then.
It suggests so. But despite that, the ideal often pushed by physicians was still quite businesslike. Get the conception done efficiently, then stop. Minimal fuss, quick ejaculation.
So mostly functional, with maybe a hint that her pleasure mattered for making babies.
That sums it up pretty well. Largely a functional act, but with occasional medical hints that female pleasure, specifically orgasm, played a role in conception, according to their theories.
And without modern contraception, pregnancy was constant.
A very regular occurrence, yes. A typical peasant woman might endure many pregnancies, perhaps having 3 to 6 children who actually survived into adulthood. It meant women spent most of their adult lives either pregnant or nursing.
So a baby almost every year.
Often, yes. And while large families were the norm and often desired for farm labor, too many mouths to feed could lead to disease and scarcity.
Did they try space births at all?
They did, using rather crude methods. Prolonged breastfeeding was common, and that naturally suppresses fertility to some extent. And they definitely used herbal contraceptives, though their effectiveness was probably quite low. But generally, yes, large families were the standard.
What about their actual knowledge of anatomy and how sex worked?
It was pretty patchy, honestly. Rudimentary and incomplete. Men understood the basic penis and vagina mechanics leading to pregnancy and the idea that both sexes had seed.
Did they understand female orgasm?
They had a concept of it, yes, and even a term for the clitoris nympha or nymphe. Educated men, like the famous physician Avicenna, even advised husbands to caress the wife's breasts and pubic area to help her achieve orgasm, again linked to conception.
But overall understanding was weak.
Very weak. The womb was a mystery, a sort of hidden cave. Female anatomy was often just thought of as an inverted, inside-out version of male anatomy. Medical texts might advise women on posture or using herbal pessaries to help conceive, but it was based on flawed ideas.
So where did ordinary people get their information?
Primarily from midwives and older family members, especially women. Mothers and midwives passed down knowledge about childbirth, family planning, folk remedies, not formal schooling. If you lived in medieval times, relying on stories and what the local midwife told you, how would you understand your own body, its cycles, and how a baby was made? It was a very different world of knowledge.
And talking about sex openly, that was rare.
Highly restricted in public, most people just didn't chat about their sex lives casually.
Maybe young people joked about it.
Sure, giggling secrets or jokes among peers. But families, respectable folk, they generally avoided the topic.
So discussions were mostly private.
Usually. Women might confide in a midwife or an older woman, especially about childbirth or trying not to get pregnant. Men might swap crude stories or boasts down at the tavern.
And since most people couldn't read,
Exactly, most talk was oral. Though you did have things like broadside ballads or popular plays that could be quite bawdy, mocking sexual topics. That was more part of the coarse folk culture.
were women expected to be silent about it?
Generally, yes. Modest and shy was the ideal for women. Men might brag in alleys or taverns. Noble literature, those troubadour songs or courtly romances, sometimes discussed love and sex, but usually wrapped in metaphor and aimed at the upper classes.
Okay, so we know privacy was scarce. Where did sex actually happen most often?
Well, beds, obviously. even if they were shared with half the family. Or just sleeping surfaces like a mattress or a pile of hay in the corner.
Nobles had it slightly better.
If they were wealthy enough, yes. A nice house might have a proper bedchamber, maybe with curtains for a bit of seclusion.
But for villagers,
Back to the hayloft or the outhouse, maybe, for a quick private moment. Summer festivals offered a bit more license for public flirting and perhaps slipping away.
otherwise sneaking around.
Pretty much. Lovers needing a quick tryst would have to find a spot behind the barn, down by the river, maybe even duck into the church when nobody was looking. They really had to make the best of very little privacy.
So far, we've taken a stroll through the daily realities of medieval life, and it's clear that while rigid rules existed, common people adapted and found ways to navigate intimacy, often in surprising and very human ways. It's a powerful reminder of how resilient people were.
Let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode from the everyday lives. Marriage was often young, practical, with sex mainly for procreation. Privacy was incredibly scarce, leading to intimacy in shared spaces or outdoors. Sex in marriage was a duty, though some hints of foreplay for female arousal appear in manuals. Women spent most adult life pregnant or nursing. Large families were common. Knowledge of anatomy was patchy. Midwives were key sources for women. Public talk about sex was rare, mostly private jokes or specific contexts. Medieval couples were resourceful, finding intimacy wherever they could.
Let's turn our attention now to that pivotal moment of marriage itself and the intense focus on virginity in the medieval world. The wedding night wasn't just romance, it was loaded with expectations, rituals, and sometimes pretty serious consequences. #4. Marriage, virginity, and the first time.
Okay, expectations for the bride and groom. They were generally expected to be, well, physically mature enough, sort of adult-sized and healthy, often in their early to mid-teens, as we said.
And theology had specific ages.
It did. Canon law often cited 12 for girls and 14 for boys as the age of maturity for marriage consent.
And virginity for the bride. That was huge.
It's extremely precious. Seen as the ideal state, the church taught losing it outside of marriage was a serious sin.
What about the groom?
Also praised if he was a virgin, but there was definitely a double standard. If a young man wasn't a virgin before marriage, it often got a sort of wink and a nod treatment.
Yeah.
The main thing was that he needed to be capable of consummating the marriage on the wedding night.
So, summing it up, young women had to be pristine, young men just had to be functional.
That's a blunt way to put it, but pretty accurate for the time.
And this obsession with bridal virginity was intense.
Fanatical, really. Proof was often expected. If a woman didn't show bloodstains on the sheets or have other proof of her hymen breaking,
She could be accused of lying.
yes, and face serious consequences. There was even a legal concept, the false virgin, where a husband could actually sue if he discovered his bride hadn't been a virgin.
Wow. And women tried to fake it.
Absolutely. Trotula, a famous female physician, actually included recipes in her writings for brides to fake virgin blood, using things like herbs, certain tree barks, or even leeches applied discreetly to produce bleeding and avoid a scandal.
Leeches. Good grief. What about displaying the bloody sheets? Was that real?
It's debated by historians. The idea of communities setting up a quilt or sheet to catch the blood on the wedding night for a public display pops up in some accounts, but how widespread it actually was is unclear. It might be more legend than common practice.
But the core idea was honor versus shame.
Exactly. Virginity meant honor for the bride and her whole family. Its absence brought shame and real trouble. Think of how much pressure this would put on a young woman, not just to be a virgin, but to prove it under intense scrutiny. It's almost like a public performance.
And the marriage contracts themselves, mostly business.
Primarily, yes. Agreements about property, dowries, forging alliances between families. Romance wasn't the point.
Did they mention sex?
Not explicitly, usually, but conjugal duties were definitely implied. Wedding vows would include promises of fidelity, but very little about pleasure or, whether the couple actually liked each other.
But consummation was key, legally.
Very important. The marriage was legally binding once the vows were exchanged, even if done by proxy, sometimes for nobles. But it wasn't considered fully complete, sealed, until it was consummated in the marriage bed. That first sexual union was the act that really finalized the deal, both legally and spiritually in many people's eyes.
Could you get an annulment if it wasn't consummated?
Yes, in Catholic theology, an unconsummated marriage could sometimes be annulled. Although, interestingly, after the 12th century, the Pope's ruled that consent alone was what made a marriage valid. So consummation became more of a technicality legally, but it still held huge symbolic weight for people as proof of commitment and, crucially, potential fertility.
And the first night itself was surrounded by myths and rituals.
Oh, definitely. A very charged atmosphere. You find lots of references in Fabliaux, those funny, often bawdy, medieval stories, and plenty of superstitions about the first night.
Like the droit du seigneur, the lord getting the first night.
That's the most famous myth. The idea that a feudal lord had the right to sleep with a serf's bride on her wedding night. Most historians now think this rarely, if ever, actually happened systematically. It was likely more of a literary trope or a local abuse of power in isolated cases, not a widespread legal right. But it certainly persisted in stories.
What other rituals? The bloody sheet again?
Traditions like the bride maybe tossing out a white cloth afterwards to prove her virginity are mentioned. But often, accounts suggest the couple might just stay quite sober and quiet, perhaps with family listening nervously from the next room, but not directly interfering. Folk traditions varied hugely across regions. Some had elaborate blessing rituals, others just a big feast the next morning.
And compatibility, just not discussed beforehand.
Almost never, especially in arranged marriages. It just wasn't a factor. Though it's fascinating, there was one medieval writer who caused a stir by arguing that a marriage without enjoyment was actually unnatural, almost comparing a pleasureless marriage to adultery. A very radical idea for the time.
Beyond the common notion of droit du seigneur, what other lesser-known rituals might have surrounded a medieval wedding night? Perhaps things related to fertility blessings or warding off evil spirits.
Yes, things like blessing the marriage bed, sometimes sprinkling holy water or placing certain herbs into the pillow for fertility. There were definitely localized folk rituals aimed at ensuring fruitfulness and protecting the new union.
So for most couples, especially arranged ones, it was just duty.
Deals, not love matches. That was the reality for noble and peasant families alike. Marriages were strategic alliances. Spouses often barely knew each other, yet they were expected to get into bed, have sex, and start producing heirs immediately.
No talk of chemistry?
Completely unheard of. Personal preference wasn't part of the equation. It was all about duty to the family, to the lineage. Although, as we mentioned, by the 14th century, you start seeing some thinkers suggesting that maybe good sex was important for marital harmony.
Because of that two-seed theory again, needing the wife to orgasm.
That played into it for some, yes. If conception required her orgasm, then maybe compatibility mattered a tiny bit. But it was still a very fringe view. For the vast majority of arranged marriages, compatibility was a non-issue. Duty came first, last, and always.
We've just journeyed through the expectations and anxieties surrounding marriage and virginity. It's clear that these were not just personal events, but profound social and even legal contracts, with the most intimate moments weighed down by an incredible amount of cultural and religious significance. Let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode on marriage and first times. Virginity was paramount for brides, so much so that it was sometimes faked with herbs or even leeches. Consummation, not just consent, was often what truly sealed the marriage in people's minds, legally and symbolically. The myth of droit du seigneur, the Lord's right, persisted in stories, even though it was likely rare in practice. Arranged marriages prioritized family and economic ties way above personal chemistry or love. A radical minority idea emerged, suggesting that a marriage without pleasure was actually unnatural. Now let's turn into the shadows, shall we? Let's explore the acts and desires that medieval society deemed utterly forbidden, taboo, even illegal. This is where church condemnation met secular law, leading to some really severe punishments and revealing the deepest fears about morality. Hashtag #55. Forbidden, taboo, and illegal sex acts.
Adultery, obviously, was a big one. Sex outside marriage was a mortal sin in the church's eyes. And for a married woman, it was often treated almost like a property crime.
A crime against her husband.
Exactly. Dishonoring him, his family, the church. And the punishments were incredibly unequal.
How so?
An unfaithful wife could face public whipping, having her head shaved, being banished from town. In some regions, a husband who caught his wife in the act could legally kiss both her and her lover on the spot without punishment.
Wow. What about noblemen?
Well, noblemen often got away with it. Their affairs might cause scandal, but their value for continuing dynasties often protected them. Poor women, on the other hand, faced the harshest consequences. Severe fines, exile, worse.
And if a married man cheated?
Usually a much lighter penalty, maybe just a church penance. Often it wasn't even prosecuted unless his mistress happened to be married too. Adultery laws definitely varied place to place, but the overall trend was stark. Wives paid dearly, husbands often didn't.
Okay, what about other acts? Masturbation, oral, anal sex.
Strictly forbidden by church law. As we mentioned, any sex act that wasn't penis and vagina for procreation often got lumped under the broad label of sodomy.
And considered a grave sin.
Absolutely. Masturbation could earn you weeks of fasting as penance. Oral sex was seen as particularly taboo. One 13th century penitential actually called it the worst of mortal sins.
The worst. That is intense. You really get a sense of how narrowly they defined acceptable intimacy.
Right. Anal sex was similarly condemned as against nature. These prohibitions largely came from interpretations of St. Paul's writings and medieval theologians who decided anything not leading to vaginal pregnancy was inherently unnatural and sinful.
That people still did these things.
The advice in marriage manuals sometimes implies they did, but the acts themselves were heavily stigmatized. And in criminal law, anal and oral sex were often grouped right alongside bestiality as crimes against nature, potentially carrying penalties like fines, whipping, or even worse in some areas.
What about same-sex behavior, what we'd now call LGBTQ behavior?
Officially, homosexual acts and the focus was almost entirely on male. Male acts were damned by church councils as against nature, another form of sodomy.
What were the penalties? Did they change over time?
They did. In the earlier medieval period, committing sodomy might lead to a lengthy penance like a year of fasting, but usually not execution. But by the late 1200s, things got much harsher. Secular courts started getting involved.
Meaning?
Punishments became brutal. Castration, dismemberment, even burning at the stake for repeat offenders in some places.
And lesbian acts?
They were recognized as sinful, yes, but generally treated less harshly than male sodomy. Partly, perhaps, because male clergy had difficulty even conceiving of the depth or nature of female same-sex relationships, but still considered sinful.
Was enforcement consistent?
Not at all. You had periods of intense persecution, pogroms, even Montesquieu wrote about mass executions in Germany. But you also had pockets of relative tolerance or clergy who might just overlook cases or keep them confined to private confession.
And critically, no concept of gay identity.
Absolutely the crucial point. There was no idea of being gay or homosexual as an identity. It was about the act. A person committed sodomy. They weren't defined as a sodomite in the way we think of identity today. It's a subtle but important distinction, not I am a sodomite, but I have committed sodomy. How does that shift in language change your understanding of self and sin?
Okay, moving to the extremes. Bestiality and incest.
Regarded as the absolute ultimate perversions. Medieval law often grouped sex with animals, or close incest like father-daughter, right alongside the most heinous crimes like murder or devil worship.
Penalties.
Being caught having sex with an animal almost always resulted in the death penalty in most regions. Incest was similarly lethal, sometimes leading to the disgrace or even execution of entire families if discovered.
The church saw it as devilry.
Definitely. Signs of demonic influence. This led to some truly bizarre trials, like digging up the remains of sinful animals involved or condemning whole families associated with the act.
Animal trials? Seriously?
Yes, they actually put animals on trial for things like bestiality. The animal, maybe a pig or a goat, was often blamed right alongside the human. Christian chronicles even mention goats and cows being formally tried for, essentially attacking a woman's honor or being involved in illicit acts. Priests and judges reacted with absolute horror to any hint of these taboos.
And we know about these forbidden acts largely from church records.
Church trial notes, yes. And those incredibly detailed penitential handbooks, they provide a wealth of often explicit information.
Like Burchard of Worms asking about dildos.
Exactly. His penitential around the year 1000 had priests asking things like, did the woman fashion a device like a man's phallus to satisfy women's lust? Medieval confession books meticulously listed every possible sexual act as a potential sin, pushing priests to get exact admissions.
Inquisitors look for this stuff too.
Sometimes. If they were probing for heresy, they might also uncover or suspect secret sins like sleeping with demons, or even sacred pigs in some bizarre accounts. Hundreds of court records survive across Europe, detailing confessions often extracted under torture, we have to remember, of adultery, sodomy, witchcraft involving sex, incest. They showed these crimes were taken very seriously, even if enforcement was chaotic.
Some confessions must have been pretty wild.
Absolutely. Descriptions of monks admitting to orgies in the woods with witches, things that sound completely fantastical, likely fueled by fear, torture, and the prevailing beliefs about demons.
Okay, let's talk about prostitutes. They seem to occupy a strange gray area.
A very peculiar position, yes. Deemed sinful? Absolutely. But also widely seen as sort of unavoidable. A necessary evil, almost.
So brothels were tolerated.
In most cities, yes. Regulated brothels were often tolerated and frequently managed or taxed by the church itself.
The church taxed brothels.
They did. Common whores, as they were called, had to pay taxes or fees, were confined to specific red light districts, and sometimes even had royal patrons. The church generally framed prostitutes more as victims of male lust, rather than solely being the perpetrators of sin.
But they still had low status.
Extremely low, often forced to live outside the city walls, required to wear special hoods or badges to identify themselves. There are even accounts from chroniclers of husbands driving wives they considered disobedient to prostitutes, arguing it was better there than in the family home.
Could they reform?
The church did offer penance for reform, which could allow a woman to marry later, but unrepentant prostitutes were denied burial in consecrated ground.
What about the clients?
The double standard again. Clients usually got off much lighter, maybe a bribe, a slap on the wrist. The women bore the brunt of the consequences. Why do you think the church, while condemning prostitution, also tolerated and even taxed brothels? What does that tell us about their societal priorities? It really speaks to a kind of grim pragmatism.
We've just navigated the labyrinth of forbidden acts and the severe consequences medieval society inflicted upon those who broke its sexual rules. It's a stark portrait of a world grappling with desire and morality, often through harsh and unequal justice.
Forbidger. Let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode from the forbidden side. Adultery for women was often treated like a property crime, with punishments vastly unequal compared to men. Oral and anal sex were broadly condemned as sodomy, with oral sex sometimes shockingly called the worst mortal sin. Homosexual acts were officially damned, leading to brutal secular punishments later on, but crucially, no concept of gay identity existed then. Beastiality and incest were the ultimate perversions, often punishable by death, and even bizarrely leading to animal trials. Confession manuals and court records give us explicit, sometimes disturbing details of medieval sexual sins. Prostitution was treated as a necessary evil, sinful, yet tolerated, regulated, and even taxed by the church.
Okay, let's expand a bit more on that curious world of sex work in the Middle Ages. It's fascinating how, despite all the moral condemnation, prostitution wasn't just tolerated. It was often regulated, taxed, and woven right into the fabric of medieval city life. It reveals a real paradox between public morality and practical necessity. #6. Sex work and prostitution.
Sex work was remarkably prevalent. You'd find it in towns of all sizes, large and small.
Where were brothels usually located?
Often near places where men gathered. Marketplaces, bathhouses were common spots. Every market town likely had designated streets or houses of prostitution. Even kings and nobles were known to patronize specific, sometimes quite established, royal brothels.
So, near trade routes, castles.
Exactly. Anywhere men congregated. And it wasn't just cities. Rural areas might have occasional brothels too, or perhaps traveling pleasure vendors moving from place to place.
And Thomas Aquinas had that striking analogy.
Yes, comparing prostitutes to necessary sewers for society. His argument basically was that regulated prostitution provided a controlled outlet for men's lust, which in turn protected respectable married women from assault or unwanted advances. A pretty grim justification, but influential.
So there was a distinction between legal and illegal operations.
Definitely. The church and city governments largely tolerated licensed brothels.
But with strict rules.
Very strict. Confined to specific streets or districts, often outside the main city walls. The women working there usually had to register, maybe pay a fee to the local bishop or authorities, and crucially, wear a special item of clothing, like a particular hood or badge, so they could be easily identified.
And these places were taxed.
Yes, often taxed by church courts or city officials. Sometimes the revenue generated was even used to support monasteries or charitable causes, believe it or not.
So who are the illegal prostitutes?
Those operating outside this system. Clandestine workers, perhaps foreign women, or those who caused trouble or refused to follow the rules. They risked arrest by civic guards or church authorities if caught. Interestingly, police records sometimes show clients being caught more often than the women themselves.
Describe that scene, walking through a medieval town.
Imagine it. You pass the bustling market square, the workshops, maybe the church. Then you might turn down a specific, often slightly rougher street. And there, certain houses would be marked maybe with that distinctive hood hanging by the door, or a painted sign indicating this is a licensed brothel, operating with the tacit, taxed approval of the very authorities who preached against lust. It's quite a jarring image.
What was their actual role in society, beyond the sewer idea?
It was complex. They were simultaneously vilified, seen as sinners, yet also acknowledged as a functional part of the social fabric.
Who are the clients?
A huge range. Lords, knights, soldiers, merchants, students, even priests and monks, despite their vows. Royal courts often had famous courtesans who weren't just mistresses, but wielded real, albeit unofficial, political influence.
Institutions patronized them too. Universities, monasteries.
There are accounts suggesting that yes, universities might turn a blind eye to students visiting designated brothels. There are even tales, perhaps exaggerated, of monasteries housing prostitutes nearby as a source of revenue, though that was likely scandalous if true, but the core idea persisted. They were a necessary evil, providing an outlet for male desire to prevent worse problems, like the rape of respectable women.
Did they ever interact with the legal system?
Sometimes, in strange ways. Judges might occasionally require a prostitute to testify in a case, though often veiled for modesty. There are even bizarre accounts of judges ordering men to take their wives to licensed prostitutes for sexual guidance or instruction. The church itself constantly debated how to treat them. Some clergy wanted harsh penance, others blamed the clients more.
So attitudes were really ambivalent.
Completely contradictory. On one hand, society labeled them sinners, outcasts, half-people, echoing that harsh sewer analogy from Aquinas.
But politicians argued they were needed.
Many did, quite openly. They argued that getting rid of prostitution would just lead to more assaults on married women or worse sins among men who were supposed to be celibate, like clergy. So prostitutes became this controlled, albeit sinful, outlet for urges deemed uncontrollable.
How did different classes interact with them?
Noblemen often treated hiring a prostitute like any other service transaction. Monks and scholars even wrote treatises discussing the morals prostitutes should uphold, oddly enough.
What about the women themselves? Any agency?
Very little. They endured significant social stigma. While some charitable efforts existed to help women trapped by misfortune, they had few rights. Some towns even built special chapels near the brothel districts for prostitutes to confess and try to purify themselves, especially before death.
Was there a difference between casual sex and professional sex work?
People did differentiate, yes. A married woman flirting perhaps too much at a tavern or a traveling salesman visiting a brothel both might be considered guilty of adultery or fornication in the eyes of the church. It was a public sin whether money changed hands or not.
But prostitution was a recognized job, albeit a disreputable one.
Yes, almost always seen as a specific, albeit low-status profession. Church law technically didn't exempt women who engaged in unpaid extramarital sex, but enforcement often targeted the professional sex workers more harshly if caught. A prostitute might be penalized for seduction, while a high-status married lady having an affair might just get a stern talking to from her confessor, unless it caused a huge scandal. Consider the medieval double standard. How might a respectable woman who had an affair be treated differently from a professional sex worker, even if both were technically committing sin?
It's a really complex picture, isn't it? Prostitution was both demonized and, in a strange way, institutionalized. It shows just how pragmatic medieval society could be, even with its deeply religious beliefs, finding a way to contain what it considered inevitable.
Here's what stuck with me from this chapter. Quick flashcard mode on sex work. Sex work was surprisingly widespread, often officially tolerated and licensed by both church and city authorities. Thomas Aquinas famously and grimly called prostitutes necessary sewers for channeling male lust away from respectable women. Licensed brothels were often taxed, sometimes by church courts, with the women forced to wear special identifying badges or hoods. Prostitutes were deeply vilified as sinners, yet simultaneously seen by many as a necessary evil, crucial for social stability. A stark double standard existed, with female sex workers facing much harsher penalties and stigma than their male clients typically did.
Let's step now into another deeply personal and often very secret realm. How medieval people dealt with the realities of pregnancy, fertility, and crucially, how they tried to control it. Despite very stern church opposition, there was this whole world of folk knowledge and clandestine practices, mostly held and passed down by women. #7, birth control, pregnancy, and abortion.
Medieval people definitely had ways, or at least tried ways, to prevent pregnancy, even though the church strongly condemned it. It wasn't just superstition, there were actual folk remedies.
Used by whom? Just women?
Mostly women, yes, but even some learned doctors discussed these things. They used herbal contraceptives, certain rituals, ancient medical texts that were being rediscovered, like Cyrannus of Ephesus's work from the 2nd century, offered advice.
Like what?
Things like advising a woman to take a deep breath and pull back sharply during her partner's orgasm, trying to prevent semen deposition. Midwives were key here. They taught wives about using pessaries.
Pessaries, like suppositories.
Exactly. Herbal suppositories inserted after sex, They used ingredients like cedar oil, rue, pennyroyal things, believed to either kill sperm or perhaps induce a very early abortion.
Were there magical methods too?
Oh, yes. Some believed you could space births by timing intercourse with phases of the moon or by wearing specific magical charms or amulets.
How effective was any of this?
Probably not very, by our standards. But the concept of contraception, the desire to control fertility, was certainly there. And it was largely seen as, women's business. Herbalists, midwives, older women, they held these recipes and shared them, often in hushed tones.
So even with all the church's rules, women were really trying to control their bodies with these remedies. That's actually quite empowering in a way.
It shows a definite agency, even within severe constraints. And it wasn't all folk knowledge. Many medieval medical writers actually openly included recipes in their texts for preventing conception or ending early pregnancies.
Really? In medical books?
Yes. There's a famous note from a 12th century doctor in Salerno who observed that streetwalkers, despite having sex frequently, rarely seemed to get pregnant. He implied it was because they were using potions.
What kind of potions or methods?
Texts describe concoctions using herbs like rue, asorum, peony, wild carrot seed, or those pessaries made of olive oil mixed with herbs, inserted after intercourse. There were even discussions of more extreme methods.
Like what?
In surgical manuals, as a last resort to save a mother's life during a very difficult obstructed birth, they discussed procedures like embryotomy, basically, dismembering the fetus in the womb. Horrifying, but it shows the desperate measures considered.
So this knowledge wasn't entirely secret.
Not among those who could read or had access to healers. Manuscripts circulated among literate women, surgeons, even some monks copied medical texts. But we absolutely have to acknowledge the risks. These home remedies for abortion likely had some effect, but they also carried a very significant danger to the woman's own life.
And the church's official stance?
Vehemently opposed. Any interference with potential life was condemned. Early church councils, like the one in Ansira back in 314, prescribed long periods of exile for women who had abortions.
Did secular law weigh in?
Yes, by the time of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, abortion could lead to exile or even the death penalty, especially if it was suspected the woman did it maliciously, like to prevent an unwanted heir from inheriting property. Church fathers explicitly called abortion murder.
But people still did it.
Despite the strong condemnations, it seems to have been widely practiced. And remember that preacher, John Chrysostom? He actually blamed the male clients when sex workers aborted, saying the man who put her in that position was the one truly at fault.
So it happened secretly.
Mostly, yes, especially among poorer women or sex workers. Church courts did prosecute some cases if they became public, but many midwives likely assisted quietly, perhaps for a fee. So the conclusion is officially condemned as murder, but widely practiced in secret, and often only punished if it somehow came to light and caused a scandal. Think of RUE as regret, urgency. Escape herbs like rue were often used, reflecting the desperate situations women found themselves in.
How did pregnancy itself affect a couple's sex life?
It changed the wife's status significantly. As we touched on earlier, during pregnancy and also while nursing, she was often considered ritually unclean.
Meaning no sex.
Correct. Most canon laws and theological writings forbade intercourse during the last trimester of pregnancy and for a period, often 40 days after childbirth.
Even if the woman wanted it.
Yes. Interestingly, some doctors, like Albert the Great, noted that pregnant women might actually experience increased sexual desire. But couples were still told to abstain, with the common belief being that intercourse could somehow harm the developing child or introduce impurities.
So long periods of abstinence were typical during pregnancy.
Yes, extended periods. The pregnant wife also often avoided public display, maybe wearing special concealing clothing. Essentially, as soon as it was known the woman was with child, her sexual license, even within marriage, was effectively revoked by custom and often by her husband's adherence to these rules.
And midwives were the real experts here.
Absolutely. On all things reproductive, they were the primary source of practical knowledge for most women. They gave advice on sex, fertility, childbirth itself. In many towns, they were known to offer those herbal contraceptive recipes right alongside their birthing services.
Keepers of women's knowledge.
Exactly. They trained apprentices, passing down this wisdom. The church knew this and tried to exert control. Sometimes they made midwives swear oaths not to provide abortifacients or assist in abortions. We see evidence of this in court records, where women were asked questions like, "Have you drunk any maleficium evil potion so you could not have children?"
But folk wisdom persisted.
Especially in villages, yes. Women shared tips, maybe taking cooling laxatives after sex or wearing an onion in their shoe as a contraceptive charm. Strange things, but it shows the persistence of folk beliefs. Midwives were really the gatekeepers, often discreetly navigating or bending church rules to help women manage their fertility and pregnancies.
So the overall attitude towards abortion, not accepted, but
Not openly accepted or celebrated, no. But it seems many ordinary medieval people viewed it pragmatically as kind of necessary evil in desperate circumstances.
was there any sympathy?
Sometimes, yes. You find hints in saints' lives or sermons of sympathy for young unmarried girls, or perhaps prostitutes who felt forced into abortion by their situation. It suggests a nuanced view where the act was still a sin, but the blame might fall more heavily on the man or the circumstances that put the woman in that position.
Malicious abortion was treated differently.
Yes, medieval law reserved its absolute harshest penalties for women believed to have aborted maliciously, for example, to spite a husband, prevent a rival heir, or interfere with royal succession. If it happened secretly, out of desperation, and no one else was harmed, it often just remained hidden. So it was a crime on the books, carried social stigma, but happened regularly behind closed doors, not always with dire consequences. Do you remember the subtle difference in how the church viewed an abortion if it was committed out of malice versus out of desperation?
This chapter really highlights the ingenuity and resilience of medieval women, navigating intense societal and religious pressures to control their bodies and their family sizes, often with secret knowledge passed down through generations.
Right, here's what stuck with me from this chapter. Quick flashcard mode on pregnancy and control. Medieval people, especially women, used numerous folk remedies and herbal contraceptives, despite church prohibitions. Medical texts sometimes openly detailed abortifacients, though effectiveness varied greatly and the risks were very high. The church condemned abortion as murder, but it appears to have been widely practiced in secret, with blame sometimes shifted to men. Pregnancy rendered a wife ritually unclean in many contexts, leading to extended periods of mandated sexual abstinence within marriage. Midwives were the crucial custodians of women's sexual and reproductive knowledge, often operating in a gray area relative to church rules. Attitudes towards abortion were complex, officially condemned, but sometimes viewed pragmatically as a necessary evil for women in desperate situations.
Okay, let's climb the social ladder now. Let's explore sex among the kings, queens, and nobles. Here, the personal desires, the politics, the pressures of dynasty, they all intertwined in really dramatic ways. The stakes were incredibly high, and it often allowed for behaviors that would be completely unthinkable for common folk. Hashtag 8, kings, queens, noble sex at the top.
Well, for starters, kings and powerful lords routinely kept official mistresses. It wasn't always hidden, and they often sired numerous illegitimate children.
And acknowledge them.
Frequently, yes. Powerful men might openly acknowledge their bastards, sometimes even providing them with lands, titles, setting them up quite well. Think of Catherine Swynford, mistress to John of Gaunt, a major English noble. Her children, the Beauforts, were initially illegitimate, but eventually legitimized and became hugely influential political figures.
So affairs were scandalous in theory.
In theory, condemned by the church, yes. But in practice, constant occurrences at court. Noble society had a kind of semi-tolerance, especially for a king's affairs. It rarely caused a major problem unless it threatened a political alliance or succession.
Did courtiers use mistresses for influence?
Oh, definitely. While moralists might scorn the mistresses, savvy courtiers knew that befriending the king's favorite could be a direct line to the king's ear and favor. It's incredible how openly they could have mistresses, even with the church's strong stance. It really shows the power imbalance, doesn't it?
Now, what about courtly love? That sounds more romantic.
It was a very specific, idealized romantic concept found among the nobility, particularly celebrated in troubadour poetry.
What did it involve?
The ideal was a knight's pure, chaste, almost spiritual devotion to an unattainable married lady, usually of higher status. In these poems and stories, any physical expression was often symbolic: a kiss, exchanging tokens, or if it did become sexual, it was clandestine, framed as this overwhelming, noble passion that transcended marriage vows.
So was it real or just poetry?
It blurred the lines. Sometimes it likely remained platonic admiration. But often these idealized romances probably did lead to actual secret affairs, conducted behind the backs of spouses. The whole code of courtly love gave even adulterous feelings a kind of elevating, noble gloss.
Did it influence real grat life?
It seems so. Nobles held poetry readings, sang songs about longing and devotion. It definitely lent a romantic veneer to courtly interactions, something largely absent in peasant life. But And this is crucial when political duty called, like arranging a strategic marriage. These courtly lovers were usually just pushed aside. Heirs and alliances always trumped poetic yearnings for kings and high nobles.
Sex and politics seem completely tangled at this level.
Constantly intertwined. A highborn woman's marriage wasn't about her. It was a political negotiation, making her virginity an incredibly valuable commodity for her family to trade.
Kings use sex strategically.
All the time. Henry II of England's famous affair with Rosamund Clifford wasn't just personal. It was part of his power struggle with his wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Courtly intrigue was rampant nobles maneuvering through each other's mistresses, royal bastards becoming potential rivals or pawns in succession disputes.
Could scandals ruin careers?
They could. A famous French case involved a king's mistress accusing a rival courtier of adultery, sparking major feuds. But more often than not, powerful men just escaped the consequences that commoners would face. A count might beat his wife for suspected infidelity, or imprison a rival out of jealousy, and face minimal interference from the church or secular law because of his status and power.
So they were almost above the law.
In terms of their sexual conduct, often yes. They were generally considered above local laws and customs, though not entirely immune to social gossip and reputational damage if they went too far. How did the political landscape of medieval nobility make adultery a very different kind of crime than it was for peasants? It was less about personal fin and more about dynastic stability and power.
And royal marriages themselves, purely political.
Almost entirely. Treaties sealed with weddings, not love matches.
But sex was expected?
Explicitly expected, yes, but purely for the purpose of producing heirs, especially male heirs. The emotional connection between the royal couple might be completely absent, but the duty to consummate and procreate was paramount.
Was the wedding night supervised?
Sometimes with religious oversight, yes. It was a state duty. Now, there are rare exceptions, legends of queens who supposedly remained virgins, or a few documented royal couples who lived celibately for political or religious reasons. But that was highly unusual.
Most kings just wanted sons.
And put immense pressure on their wives for, often, quite passionless consummations to achieve that goal. If the queen failed to conceive, kings wouldn't hesitate to take mistresses, hoping they would provide the necessary heir, even if the church disapproved. Henry VIII's break with Rome over his divorce is the most extreme example of how central heirs were. For most kings, consummation was expected, but romance wasn't. They often already had mistresses anyway.
Medieval history seems full of outrageous noble sex stories.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Juicy scandals abound. Eleanor of Aquitaine, again, besides her political power, she was accused of having an affair with her own uncle while married to the King of France. Later, she famously presided over courts of love.
Any other weird examples?
King Louis X of France supposedly granted prostitutes a special 8-day holiday so he could be alone with his favorite maidens. You find bizarre contracts, like a Venetian noble specifying his mistress had to leave behind all her clothes if he died first, basically leaving her destitute. And truly weird marriages enforced betrothals between toddlers and aging rulers for political gain.
A princess commissioned a sex guide.
Yes. A Spanish princess reportedly commissioned a whole series of books, 36 of them, on sexual pleasure as a wedding gift. One of the earliest known explicit sex guides, commissioned by royalty. It just shows the kind of freedom nobles had. A count could openly keep a dozen lovers, while a peasant caught in a single fling might face a flogging.
So a huge disparity in consequences compared to peasants.
Vastly different. A knight might abduct and rape a woman from a nearby village and get away with paying a fine, maybe. A serf committing a similar crime, likely execution.
Justice was private for nobles?
Often, yes. Sexual crimes or disputes among the nobility were usually handled privately within the families, or settled with payments of money or land. Commoners faced public shaming, the stocks, branding for things like adultery.
Did the church scrutinize nobles less?
Both rich and poor lived under the church's theoretical moral scrutiny, but the difference was protection and influence. A rich lord could bribe a bishop, secure a papal indulgence, smooth things over. A commoner's sins were laid bare before the local priest in the community.
So status bought freedom, but maybe not silence.
Exactly. Noble status allowed you to bend or break sexual rules with far less fear of severe legal punishment, but it didn't make you immune to damaging gossip or political fallout. Can you recall a specific instance that illustrates the vast difference in consequences for sexual crimes between a noble and a commoner? That difference is really key to understanding their society.
This chapter really pulls back the curtain on the hypocrisy and power dynamics at the top of medieval society. It's fascinating how much royal and noble sexual lives, despite being scandalous, were often intertwined with political strategy and largely immune to the punishments commoners faced.
Wait, let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode from the lives of kings and queens. Royal mistresses were commonplace and often gained significant wealth and political influence. Courtly love idealized romantic passion, sometimes serving as a cover for secret adulterous liaisons among nobles. Sex among the nobility was deeply entangled with politics. Virginity and heirs were valuable political commodities. Royal marriages were primarily political treaties, with sex viewed as a functional duty for procreation. Nobles often engaged in outrageous affairs and bizarre marital arrangements, facing far fewer consequences than commoners. A stark class divide meant nobles could largely bypass or mitigate the strict sexual laws applied to peasants.
Okay, let's shift gears now and journey into the mind of the medieval physician. Let's explore their often, well, incorrect, but utterly fascinating medical beliefs about sex. From balancing humors to the mysterious wandering womb, their understanding or misunderstanding of the body shaped not just health practices, but moral judgments too. Hashtag tag 9. Medieval medical beliefs about sex.
Medieval medicine was absolutely dominated by the theory of the four humors, and they believed an individual's temperament, governed by the balance of these humors, directly controlled their sexual desire.
So humors determine how horny you were.
Essentially, yes. Warmth and moisture in the body were thought to increase sexual vigor, drive, potency. Coldness or dryness, on the other hand, were believed to diminish libido, cause impotence.
Is there evidence of doctors saying this?
Oh, yes. The physician Ibn al-Jazar, for example, wrote explicitly that warm, moist testicles led to strong erections and plenty of semen, while cold or dry ones caused problems.
And they prescribe things based on this. Food.
Absolutely. Diet was key to managing humors. Hot spices, ginger, long pepper, saffron were prescribed to boost a lagging libido. Cooling herbs, mint, rue, were given to calm down excessive desire.
And we mentioned masturbation earlier as a way to balance humors.
Yes, physicians often reluctantly accepted it for that reason. Expelling excess sexual fluid or seed was seen as necessary to maintain humoral balance and prevent illness, even if the church disapproved strongly.
What if someone had too much lust, according to this theory?
They might recommend treatments aimed at reducing heat or moisture. Things like bloodletting or even inducing vomiting were sometimes used, believe it or not, to try and cool down the liver's heat, which they linked to desire. Also, potentially for erectile dysfunction, oddly enough.
So if I was too horny, a medieval doctor might have just made me throw up. That's definitely a unique prescription for desire.
It certainly sounds extreme to us, but their summary was, if your humors were balanced, your sex life was fine. If they were imbalanced, you'd either be excessively horny or impotent.
What about their understanding of anatomy? Was it accurate?
Largely guesswork, honestly. Based more on speculation and ancient theories than on precise observation or dissection, which was rare and often religiously restricted.
What did they know about male anatomy?
Men generally understood sperm came from the testicles, but they didn't really know about the prostate gland or other internal structures.
And female anatomy?
Even more mysterious to them. They thought women also produced a seed, maybe in the ovaries, or released some kind of female semen during orgasm. The womb itself was imagined as a sort of small cave that needed the heat from male semen during intercourse to become fertile and conceive.
How did they think babies developed?
Without microscopes, they had no idea about cells or genetics. They generally believed the male and female seeds simply melded together in the womb, forming the fetus. And they thought things like the mother's imagination during conception, or even the father's hand warmth applied to her belly, could influence the baby's development.
And the idea of female anatomy being inside out male anatomy.
That was a common way of thinking, yes. Trying to understand the mysterious female body by comparing it to the better understood male form.
Did the wandering womb idea really persist?
It did, surprisingly late for some physicians. This ancient Greek idea that the uterus wasn't fixed but could actually move around inside the woman's body, pressing on other organs.
Causing what?
All sorts of problems. Fainting spells, shortness of breath, suffocation of the womb, seizures, emotional distress, what they might have called hysteria or madness.
And menstruation. How did they explain that?
Poorly understood. Generally considered impure, unclean, sometimes explained as the female body ejecting old blood or unused seed, or just a way of getting rid of monthly waste products because women were seen as less perfect or hot than men and couldn't burn off all their fluids.
They knew both men and women had orgasms.
Yes, they recognized that. But again, it was often linked to function. They widely believed women needed to orgasm to conceive, that the orgasm opened the womb to receive the male seed. Some even argued that a wife refusing to orgasm could somehow kill the baby or prevent conception. Physicians sometimes use this idea to encourage husbands to pleasure their wives. Imagine trying to understand the incredibly complex human body with no microscopes, only rudimentary dissections, and ancient theories about wandering organs. What an act of imagination it must have been.
Let's go back to that wandering womb. That's just bizarre.
It really is. Inheriting that myth from the ancient Greeks, they genuinely believed a woman's uterus could become displaced or wander, causing suffocation, fits, hysteria.
And the cure involved sex?
Often, yes. One common cure was sexual intercourse. The idea was that the pleasure, the heat generated, particularly around the clitoris, would somehow entice the womb back down into its proper place. Fumigating the vagina with sweet-smelling substances was another related cure.
Any other strange beliefs linking sex and health?
Well, some believed intercourse acted as a kind of cleanse, purging impurities from the body. Bizarrely, some texts suggest abundant sex could cure melancholy, or even help ward off the plague by sweating out the bad humors.
But too much sex was bad.
Oh yes, definitely. Too much sex, especially considered excessive, like visiting prostitutes frequently, or even too many wet dreams, was thought to dangerously weaken a man, drain his vital heat, even shrink his brain, or shorten his life. There's a medieval story about a man who supposedly had sex 70 times in one night and just shriveled up and died.
So both too little and too much sex could cause illness.
According to their theories, yes. Doctors believed insufficient sex was harmful because it allowed poisonous humors or seed to stagnate. We mentioned women potentially suffering suffocation of the womb or hysteria from lack of sex.
And too much sex caused
Things like fever, headaches, exhaustion, even blindness, because it depleted the body's vital heat and spirits too much. Medieval medicine really blended moral judgments with health advice. Sexually active people were advised to eat well, exercise moderately, and crucially, avoid unclean partners like prostitutes or menstruating women to maintain health. Can you recall a bizarre medieval medical belief about how sex could cure an illness or how too much of sex could cause one?
Let's recap the seed and orgasm ideas. Men's seed was hot, women's cooler.
That was the general thinking, yes. And a woman's orgasm was often believed to be when she expelled her own seed, not blood. If she didn't orgasm, that seed could supposedly remain inside, taint her womb, cause illness.
And male orgasm.
Considered fiery, vital for health. A prolonged lack of ejaculation was thought to cause sickness, which is why medical manuals might recommend regular nightly sex within marriage or self-release just to maintain that humoral balance.
And menstruation remained poorly understood.
Deeply misunderstood. Seen as impure, linked to those ideas of waste, unused seed, or excess blood that needed purging.
What about problems like impotence or infertility? How were they treated?
Impotence was definitely medicalized, usually blamed on a humoral imbalance, too much coldness or dryness in the testicles or maybe the heart.
What were the remedies?
A real mix. Dietary changes, warm baths, sometimes bizarre concoctions made from things like honey, ground fish bones, or animal horns. Even looking at erotic pictures hung on the bedroom wall was suggested.
And infertility.
Similar approaches. Medical solutions targeting humors, often combined with religious interventions praying to specific fertility saints like St. Anne, or even having bed covers blessing cathedrals, hoping for divinely aided conception.
Could impotence bend a marriage?
Yes, if a man was proven to be permanently impotent and unable to consummate the marriage, it could be grounds for annulment.
What if the woman was infertile?
She was often blamed, unfortunately. Superstition might label her as cursed or sinful. Doctors might offer herbal remedies like pennyroyal tea, but the social blame often fell on her. Realistically, though, for couples facing infertility, options were limited. They prayed, maybe hired wet nurses if they adopted, or wealthy men might take concubines specifically to produce heirs. Medicine offered very few genuine cures back then.
We've just taken a deep dive into the fascinating, if often inaccurate, medical beliefs of medieval people regarding sex. It really shows how they tried to make sense of the human body and its desires, blending observation, ancient theories, and even superstition, often with significant implications for daily life and health.
Let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode from medical beliefs. Humoral theory was key, linking warmth and moisture to sexual vigor, and coldness dryness to impotence. Medieval anatomy was largely guesswork. Beliefs like the wandering womb causing hysteria persisted for a long time. Sex was paradoxically thought to cure some illnesses by expelling impurities, but too much sex could also cause sickness by draining vital heat. They believed female orgasm was crucial for conception, as it involved expelling her own seed and opening the womb. Impotence and infertility were medicalized, treated with varied and often ineffective remedies targeting humoral balance, plus prayer. Menstruation was widely misunderstood, often viewed as impure or the purging of unused seed or bodily waste.
Okay, let's lighten the mood significantly now. Let's peek behind those serious religious pronouncements and courtly dramas into the surprising world of medieval humor and entertainment. It turns out, medieval people, well, they really loved a good dirty joke. And their art, their literature, even hidden away in the margins of sacred books, was often far more explicit in body than you might imagine. #10. Porn, erotica, and dirty jokes.
Oh, absolutely. Medieval people produced and consumed all sorts of erotic material, though usually it was kept private, not for public display.
Like erotic poetry.
Yes, things like the troubadour songs we mentioned, celebrating courtly love, sometimes describing lovers' bodies quite explicitly, but also some popular romances, and especially the fabliaux, those short, comic, often satirical stories, could be outright pornographic by our standards.
Any examples?
There's a famous French fabliau by Jean Baudel about a man literally selling giant, lifelike penises at a town fair. And you see similar visual jokes about markets selling sexual organs in manuscript illustrations too. It shows a real delight in that kind of earthy sexual humor.
And the drawings in manuscripts, marginalia.
Incredible stuff sometimes. Illuminated manuscripts, often very expensive luxury items, frequently have these tiny, intricate drawings in the margins depicting all sorts of lusty or bizarre scenes. Devils copulating, knights wielding giant phalluses, animals behaving lewdly, crude drawings of genitals.
And monks did this? Wait, so monks were doodling penises and the Bibles they were copying. That's honestly pretty hilarious. What a way to pass the time.
It certainly seems that way. There are famous examples of monks decorating the blank spaces in Bibles or prayer books with clearly humorous, often obscene doodles, penises, bottoms, farting figures, likely just a way to relieve the tedium of long hours spent copying texts.
What about Shilana gigs? Those stone carvings.
Yes, those are fascinating. Found on some churches, particularly in Ireland and Britain, they're carvings of naked women, often quite grotesque, pulling open their vulvas in a very explicit display. Their exact meaning is debated, maybe fertility symbols, maybe warnings against lust, maybe even protective figures to ward off evil spirits, but they are undeniably sexualized public art.
So these marginal drawings, any specific weird ones?
Scholars have found tons. There's a 14th century French manuscript with a dragon that literally has a penis for a head, shown balancing on a woman's bed. Another one from Flanders shows a bishop pointing disapprovingly at a monk's farting rear end.
Bishops and farting monks seem to be a theme.
Apparently. The British Library has manuscripts with naked bishops scolding farting clerics, women seemingly plucking fully formed penises off a penis tree, all sorts of anatomical absurdities. It's clearly scribes and artists letting off steam with dirty jokes.
Who was the audience for this? Not the high clergy.
Probably not. These often appear in expensive luxury books made for wealthy lay patrons, or perhaps for the monks' own communities. It suggests these educated circles, both secular and monastic to some extent, enjoyed and shared this kind of body humor privately. Imagine a monk, hunched over a sacred text, meticulously copying scriptures, and then in the quiet moments adding a drawing of a bishop scolding a farting cleric. It brings a very human, rebellious touch to what we often see as a purely solemn era.
And outside of books,
Yeah.
jokes and songs.
Medieval taverns and fairs must have buzzed with them. Coarse songs, rude rhymes, they functioned like medieval stand-up comedy clubs, in a way.
Double meanings were common.
Very common, especially in folk songs sung at weddings or harvest festivals. And remember that story about the carnival cock and testicle market? From a Swiss account describing a 15th century festival where vendors were jokingly hawking cocks for 30 sous and testicles for 20, like a medieval sex toy bizarre gag.
Did they tell actual jokes or riddles?
Oh yes, plenty of raunchy riddles and jests would have circulated in pubs and marketplaces. Something like, why did the nun refuse sex? Because she ran out of holy water. Obviously sacrilegious, but the kind of thing that probably got laughs.
Did women participate in this humor?
It's harder to find direct evidence, as most surviving written jokes are from male scribes. But the nature of carnival traditions, the folk songs, suggests women absolutely participated in earthy body humor, especially in festive settings, maybe after a few drinks.
Festivals seem key for this kind of expression.
Hugely important. Sexual humor and symbolism were deeply embedded in many medieval festivals.
Like Carnival before Lent.
The prime example. A time when social rules were deliberately overturned. You'd have a lord of misrule presiding over mock ceremonies, maybe mock weddings, Townsfolk would parade around with exaggerated phallic symbols.
And that Eastern European festival with giant wooden penises.
The Barani Festival, yes.
Yeah.
Documented from medieval times onward in some regions. Men would literally parade these huge carved phalluses through the streets, singing bawdy songs, all believed to ensure the fertility of the land for the coming year.
And the maypole in England.
Widely seen as having roots as a phallic symbol, with the dancing around it likely originating as a communal fertility ritual. Even house-visiting traditions like wassailing, going door-to-door singing, especially to apple trees, often included ribald toasts and verses invoking fertility for the household and livestock.
So it was a communal joking, but also kind of serious. A prayer.
A strange mix, blending superstition, the idea that laughter and revelry bring good luck, with the very real hope that human and animal mating ensures the life and abundance of the fields and the community.
What other phallic symbols or costumes were used?
The villagers might wear masks representing animals known for virility, like goats or bulls, during certain rites. Depictions of ancient fertility gods like Priapus, famously shown with a massive erection, still appeared in late medieval art, like garden statues or palace frescoes. And those phallic races men literally running with carrots or phallic-shaped bottles stuffed down their hose, documented at some fairs. Masked figures might make lewd gestures, flip up their codpieces suggestively.
The message being?
Nature is inherently sexual, full of life and fertility, so let's celebrate it openly, at least on these special festival days when the usual rules are suspended. Imagine a modern-day carnival or Mardi Gras, and then amplify the raunchiness and phallic imagery tenfold with historical and ritualistic significance.
Was any of this explicitly for women? Erotica aimed at them?
Women weren't entirely excluded, but it was different. There were things like gynecological poems or medical handbooks written for women. Abbesses sometimes discussed which poetry was suitable for nuns to recite. You occasionally hear of female minstrels or storytellers.
But general porn was for men.
Mostly, yes. Explicitly erotic material seems overwhelmingly aimed at a male audience. Given the strong taboos surrounding female sexuality and literacy rates, erotica created by or specifically for women was much rarer. If a woman enjoyed a dirty joke, it was likely shared privately among close female friends, not in public.
It's truly fascinating to see this vibrant, earthy side of medieval life, proving that even in an era of strict religious control, humor, satire, and open celebration of sexuality, often disguised as fertility rites, found their way into daily life and artistic expression.
So, let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode about medieval humor and art. Erotic art and literature definitely existed, including sometimes quite pornographic tales and poems, but it was often kept private. Monks famously, and perhaps surprisingly, drew explicit marginalia like penises, bottoms, and lewd scenes in the margins of manuscripts. Dirty jokes, bawdy songs, and raunchy riddles were common entertainment in taverns, and especially during festivals. Festivals like Carnival and May Day were loaded with sexual symbolism featuring phallic objects and costumes, often rooted in ancient fertility rites. While most explicit erotica seems male-oriented, women likely had their own forms of sexual humor and expression, mostly shared in private settings.
Okay, let's pivot back now to the authorities. How did the church and the state actively try to enforce all these moral codes? How did they attempt to control what happened in the bedroom and beyond? This is where we see the mechanisms of power, public shaming, courts, occasionally even executions really put to work. #11, church and state control of sex.
Well, medieval authorities certainly used public punishment sometimes, aiming to make moral examples out of offenders.
How so? What kind of punishments?
Adulterous spouses might be paraded through town or forced to stand in the pillory, maybe near the church doors, often wearing signs explicitly stating their crime. For acts labeled sodomy, particularly during periods of heightened concern like the Inquisition, punishments could include public whipping or being forced to wear the San Benito, a special humiliating garment painted with symbols of their sin.
What about cracking down on brothels?
That was actually quite rare. As we discussed, prostitution was often tolerated, even taxed. So major crackdowns on brothels tended only to happen during specific waves of moralistic fervor or reform movements, not as a matter of routine enforcement.
Were confessions ever forced?
Yes, particularly in witchcraft trials. The accused were often relentlessly interrogated about every possible sexual detail, including alleged demonic encounters, frequently under torture, until they confessed to often completely implausible acts.
But executions just for sex crimes were rare.
Extremely rare, especially compared to executions for heresy or treason. The general church stance was against the death penalty for mere sin. Most penalties for sexual transgressions were things like fines, temporary exile, public humiliation, or flogging, not execution.
But there were laws about the bedroom.
Oh yes, plenty. Both church canon law and secular laws tried to regulate intimate life quite closely.
Like the Lateran Council mandating confession.
Exactly. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made annual confession mandatory for all Catholics, basically ensuring the clergy had a mechanism to inquire about and record parishioners' sins, including sexual ones, under threat of being excluded from the church community.
And secular laws.
Many kingdoms and regions had specific laws. Some German codes imposed fines for oral sex, for instance. A husband had legal standing to sue another man if that man broke into his house and was caught with his wife. Marrying without a priest present, or marrying someone within the forbidden degrees of kinship, which were quite extensive, was illegal.
And some acts were capital offenses.
Yes, under civil law in many places, severe acts like beastiality, bigamy, marrying someone while already married, incest, and sometimes sodomy could theoretically carry the death penalty.
But enforcement was light.
In practice, often yes. Unless a formal complaint was made or a major public scandal erupted that forced the authorities' hand, many of these laws regulating private behavior were probably enforced quite lightly or sporadically. Do you remember one specific, non-obvious law that tried to control activities within the medieval bedroom beyond just adultery? Perhaps related to specific positions or times.
What about the Inquisition? Did it handle sex crimes?
Primarily, no. The Inquisition, starting in the 13th century, was overwhelmingly focused on rooting out religious heresy, not prosecuting common sexual offenses.
But they sometimes got involved.
Yes, if the alleged sex crime was linked to heretical beliefs or practices. For example, accusations against groups like the Cathars sometimes included claims of ritual orgies. Or witch trials often involved charges of sex with the devil, which blended heresy and sexual crime. But standard adultery or fornication cases usually went before regular church courts, ecclesiastical courts, if clergy were involved, or secular courts and local magistrates for lay people, often after being denounced by a priest. The Inquisition itself only conducted a few specific sodomy trials, often targeting suspected heretical groups, not general sexual behavior.
So execution specifically for sex crimes remained very uncommon.
Very uncommon overall. As mentioned, the church generally opposed execution for sin alone, reserving death mostly for unrepentant heretics or those convicted of witchcraft involving demonic pacts.
Secular courts were harsher.
Sometimes. Secular courts did occasionally execute people for incest or bestiality, particularly if the case was deemed especially egregious or violated noble honor. Some late medieval rulers, like in Florence during Casanova's later period, though that's post-medieval, did declare all sodomites capital offenders, but these were generally exceptional laws or periods.
What usually happened even to sodomites?
Often, penalties like castration or banishment came before execution was considered. Adulterers were almost never executed, with rare exceptions in places like some Swiss cantons that had specific civil codes allowing burning for the seduction of a virgin.
Rapists.
Rape, especially the rape of a virgin or a noblewoman, could lead to execution. But even then, things were complicated. A jealous husband who killed his wife's lover immediately might claim self-defense or defense of honor and avoid trial, whereas a formal rape accusation had to go through the courts. So, while sex could lead to death under medieval law, it was usually connected to broader issues like defending family honor, property rights, or breaking specific civil statutes, not just moral outrage over the sexual act itself.
Now, what about the clergy themselves? They were supposed to be celibate.
Ah, the great hypocrisy. Despite church law demanding celibacy after the reforms of the 11th century, the reality was that many priests, monks, and even bishops kept concubines, sometimes referred to euphemistically as housekeepers, or had secret wives and families.
So the ban on clerical marriage didn't stick.
It stuck officially, but compliance was notoriously poor. Medieval society, while perhaps tut-tutting, largely didn't stop priests from having mistresses. One clerical manual from the time lamented that huge numbers of monks and nuns, despite their vows, were frequenting brothels and engaging in unnatural vice.
Priests having children was common knowledge.
In many cathedral cities and towns, it was an open secret. Everyone knew certain children were the priests.
And enforcement. So the very people enforcing these strict rules were often breaking them quite openly. That's just wild and so utterly human.
Enforcement against clergy was incredibly weak. The church hated publicly punishing its own members, as it caused scandal. So priests caught violating celibacy often received just a slap on the wrist, maybe a transfer, or perhaps a quiet pension was arranged for an exposed concubine. Only the most outrageous public scandals, like a bishop being caught red-handed with a bride on her wedding night, might lead to defrocking.
Did this undermine trust?
Massively. Reformers within the church constantly grumbled that the widespread hypocrisy regarding clerical sex lives made ordinary people laugh at sermons and disregard the church's moral authority.
How much did the church authorities actually know about what people were doing?
Almost certainly more than they publicly admitted. Confession, even if confidential, gave priests a direct window into the sins of their parishioners. It was clear for the sheer volume of people doing penance that rules were being broken constantly.
And in monasteries.
As close-knit, often isolated communities, it would have been virtually impossible to hide everything. Gossip travels fast.
Did higher-ups turn a blind eye?
Bishops and kings might ignore a useful priest's indiscretions, especially if his unofficial family brought wealth or connections. But they could also use gossip and accusations of sexual misconduct as political leverage against rivals within the church or nobility.
So they kept tabs.
Officially, local priests often claimed ignorance of sins outside the confessional. But records like church court proceedings or lists of assigned penances show the church did keep surprisingly meticulous tabs on moral transgressions, even if they weren't always publicizing it. Inquisitors investigating heresy often stumbled upon evidence of sexual misdeeds too, and local whisper networks ensured clergy were reasonably well informed about their communities.
So a public pretense of ignorance.
Largely, yes. The church acted like it knew nothing beyond formal confessions or public scandals. But historians generally agree. Medieval society was a place where everyone knew everybody's business, more or less. Yet they maintained this social performance of constant surprise and indignation when rules were broken openly.
It's clear that medieval society, with its church and state, created an intricate web of control around sex, but often with loopholes, hypocrisies, and a profound gap between stated ideals and lived realities. The tension between public moralizing and private knowing is truly striking.
Let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode from church and state control. Public punishments for sexual sins, like the pillory or wearing shameful signs, were used as moral examples, though executions solely for sex were rare. Both church and secular laws attempted to regulate many bedroom behaviors, enforced through mandatory confession and sometimes secular courts. The Inquisition rarely targeted sex crimes directly, unless they were explicitly linked to accusations of heresy or witchcraft. Clerical celibacy, despite being official doctrine, was widely flaunted by priests and monks, significantly undermining trust in the church's moral authority. The church likely knew far more about people's sexual activities than it publicly admitted, using confession, local courts, and social networks to monitor behavior while maintaining a facade of propriety.
Okay, let's delve now into the inner world, the psychology of medieval people. How do they understand themselves in relation to their sexuality? We're not talking modern labels here, but about how pervasive ideas of shame, guilt, and faith shape their individual experiences and even their very concept of identity. Hashtag TAC12, psychology and sexual identity.
This is a crucial point. The medieval world simply did not have our modern concept of sexual identity. Labels like gay or straight or bisexual just didn't exist in their framework.
So how are people defined?
Primarily as Christians who either did or did not commit certain sinful acts. Your actions defined your moral standing, not an internal orientation.
So if a man was attracted to other men?
The expectation was still for him to marry a woman and have children. If he acted on his attraction to men, that was simply a sin. The act of sodomy, not an identity he possessed.
And for women?
The expectation was wife and mother, or perhaps a chaste virgin, like a nun. If a woman seemed to enjoy sex too much or express desire openly, it wasn't seen as part of her identity, but typically as a moral weakness, a sign of being possessed by lust, perhaps even demonic influence.
It's such a profound difference. Not having those words to describe yourself must have fundamentally changed how you understood your own desires and place in the world.
Absolutely. A person's core identity was rooted in their social class or estate, peasant, noble, clergy, their family lineage, and their Christian faith. It wasn't tied to who they found sexually attractive or who they slept with. You wouldn't hear someone say, "I'm a sodomite." You'd hear that someone was accused of having committed sodomy. The focus was always on the sinful act, not the person's intrinsic nature.
Did this lead to widespread shame and guilt?
Almost certainly. Given the constant barrage of church teachings about sin and lust, virtually everyone likely experienced some degree of guilt, anxiety, or fear about their sexual feelings and actions.
A devout peasant might feel genuinely damned.
Quite possibly, yes. Believing that mere lustful thoughts, let alone actions, could lead directly to hellfire would create immense internal misery for someone deeply religious.
But was everyone constantly miserable about it?
Probably not. While the guilt was pervasive, human pragmatism also played a role. The average person likely did what they felt driven to do, perhaps ignored the sermons most of the time, and only confronted the guilt directly during confession or if they got caught and faced consequences.
The devil was blamed a lot.
Constantly. Confession manuals are full of reminders that the devil's always there, tempting individuals towards lust and other sins. People wrote about their internal struggles, this fight or flight against temptation. Monks might flog themselves after having erotic dreams. Nobles might write philosophical treatises about resisting desire.
So repression and guilt existed alongside defiance, pragmatism.
Exactly. It wasn't monolithic. While repression and guilt were deeply embedded in the culture, so were quiet defiance, finding loopholes, and a pragmatic approach, especially among secular folk who might treat the strictest church rules more like suggestions than absolute commands.
How did people define their personal identity, if not through sexuality?
Primarily through their social role, their estate, as mentioned. Are you a priest, a peasant farmer, a knight, a merchant's wife? And crucially, through your family lineage and connections. Your place in the community and the social hierarchy was paramount.
So no sense of my sexuality defines me.
None whatsoever. A man was defined as a father, a husband, the head of his household, and maybe secondarily as an adulterer or bachelor if he failed in those roles. A woman was defined as a mother, a daughter, a wife.
Were there terms for sexually promiscuous people?
Yes, but they were seen as character flaws, not identities. Someone might be known as a lecher, or a woman as wanton or loose. These were negative personality traits, descriptions of behavior, not fundamental categories of being. In a village, a young bride who was perhaps a bit flirtatious might be jokingly called naughty, but never labeled according to a sexual orientation. How might your sense of self be different if your identity was primarily defined by your social role, your family, and your faith, rather than your innermost desires?
Was joining the clergy ever seen as linked to sexuality, like avoiding marriage?
That's perhaps the only subtle hint. Some historians speculate that individuals who were homosexual might have chosen the clergy specifically to avoid the social pressure of marriage and procreation. It offered a legitimate, celibate alternative. But there's no explicit documentation confirming this as a widespread motivation.
Did people have any freedom or agency in their sex lives? Moments of release?
There were moments, yes, structured outlets. Carnival, as we discussed, was a time when rules were temporarily suspended, allowing for role reversal, body jokes, more license.
What about soldiers or sailors?
They often had considerably more freedom when away from home. Soldiers on campaign frequently had access to camp followers. Sailors were known for telling ribald tales and perhaps having encounters in foreign ports. Courtly circles also offered noblemen much more sexual license and opportunities for discreet affairs compared to peasants tied to their land and community.
But female agency was limited.
Severely limited for the most part. A married woman's primary duty was often seen as satisfying her husband's needs and producing children. A virgin daughter's duty was obedience to her parents regarding marriage.
What if a woman openly expressed desire?
She would almost certainly be shamed, labeled as wanton or sinful. The underlying assumption was that men naturally and constantly desired sex, while women's desire was weaker, more passive, or ideally non-existent outside of procreation. We know now that's not true, but sources do indicate women experienced desire and trauma, even if it was rarely acknowledged or depicted realistically in the literature of the time.
Let's talk about consent. By our standards, medieval society seems harsh.
Incredibly harsh, yes. The concept of consent, as we understand it today, was largely absent, especially for women and children. They could be married off without their meaningful consent, sometimes at very young ages. Sexual exploitation within families or by those in power occurred with little recourse. Even bride kidnapping, while perhaps illegal, still happened.
Was rape recognized as a crime?
Yes, rape was legally recognized as a crime, going back to Roman law under Justinian. But how seriously it was prosecuted often depended heavily on the victim's social status. Raping a noblewoman was treated far more severely than raping a peasant girl or a prostitute.
And within marriage, could a wife refuse sex?
She had very limited right to refuse her husband. The idea of marital rape simply did not exist as a concept. A husband was generally considered to have a right to sexual access to his wife.
Were there any emerging rights for women?
Some small steps. Church courts occasionally upheld a widow's right to refuse remarriage against her family's wishes. And by the 12th century, as we mentioned, the church did start emphasizing that consent from both parties was necessary for a valid marriage. even if that consent was often coerced or given under duress in practice. Emotional trauma from sexual violence or coercion was undoubtedly real, but medieval writers rarely analyzed it psychologically. Suffering was more often expressed through religious language, prayers, tears, lamentations about sin or misfortune, like she wept her soul. Do you remember a specific example of how consent, or the lack thereof, was viewed differently for women in medieval society compared to modern times? Perhaps regarding arranged marriages or a husband's rights?
What about women's desire itself? How is it actually viewed?
It's contradictory. Official church doctrine often portrayed women as inherently more lustful, weaker, more easily tempted, harking back to Eve's sin. Secular stories and fablio often depicted women as sexually insatiable or deceitful and harshly punished them for expressing desire.
But doctors acknowledged it.
Yes. Physicians influenced by Greek medicine sometimes acknowledged female desire and pleasure, advising men on how to arouse their wives, mainly for conception. And poets in the courtly love tradition sometimes wrote from a female perspective expressing longing.
What about ordinary women?
Anecdotally, you hear varied accounts. Strong-willed peasant women might demand sex as often as their husbands. Others, perhaps older or weary from childbirth, might try to avoid it. Noble women often had little choice in their marriages, but there are accounts of kings complaining about wives throwing tantrums if denied sex, perhaps a medieval form of asserting desire or protesting neglect.
So expression was frowned upon, but desire existed.
Absolutely. Public expression by women was heavily discouraged and shamed, but desire itself certainly existed. It often surfaces indirectly in stories as envy, anger, plots of seduction or manipulation. Midwives, dealing directly with women's bodies and lives, and even nuns in convents, where pregnancies sometimes occurred, would have been well aware that many women experienced and enjoyed sexual pleasure. Ultimately, both genders experienced lust, but men completely dominated the social and legal landscape. Women had very limited, socially sanctioned spaces to express desire openly, perhaps only within the coded language of courtly love poetry, or maybe paradoxically, within the secrecy of the confessional.
This exploration of medieval psychology reveals a world without our modern concepts of sexual identity, where shame and guilt were pervasive, but also where individuals found moments of agency and expressed desires in fascinating, often hidden ways. It's a testament to the enduring human spirit amidst intense societal constraints.
Let's lock this in. Quick flashcard mode about medieval psychology. No concept of sexual identity as we know it existed. People were defined by their acts, sins, or duties, not an inherent orientation. Widespread shame and guilt about sex, fueled by church teachings, were often countered by pragmatic defiance and finding loopholes. Personal identity was primarily rooted in one's social estate, class role, and family ties, not individual sexual preferences or desires. Women's sexual agency was severely limited socially and legally, though their desire was medically acknowledged and sometimes forcefully if indirectly expressed. Consent was a fluid and often disregarded concept by modern standards, especially for women within marriage, though the idea of consent for marriage itself gained ground. Despite official portrayals often depicting women as either passive or dangerously lustful, female desire was a known, if often unspoken or repressed, reality.
Okay, let's step back out now, away from the internal world and the official strictures, and explore the vibrant, sometimes downright raucous ways medieval people celebrated and expressed sexuality in their popular culture. The festivals, the folklore, the songs. This is where inhibitions often seem to dissolve, and ancient traditions came roaring back to life with surprising frankness. #tag13, sex in popular culture, festivals, and folklore.
Many medieval festivals, when you look closely, seem to be thinly veiled pagan celebrations, really focusing on sex, fertility, and the renewal of life.
Carnival being the big one.
Absolutely, the period right before Lent. It was famous for deliberately turning social norms upside down. You'd have a lord of misrule chosen to preside over mock ceremonies, chaos, and revelry. And yes, townsfolk would often parade around with exaggerated, often comical phallic symbols.
And that Eastern European festival.
The Barani.
Yes, documented from medieval times. Men literally parading giant carved wooden penises through the streets, singing very bawdy songs. The explicit purpose was to magically ensure the fertility of the land for the crops in the coming year. Giant wooden penises being paraded through the streets. That's certainly not what they taught us in history class. It's so openly celebratory of fertility.
It really is. And in England, the May Day celebrations, especially the maypole, essentially a large pole erected and danced around, is widely interpreted by folklorists as having phallic symbolism, rooting back to ancient fertility rituals. Even traditions like wassailing, where people sang to apple trees for a good harvest, often included very ribald toasts and verses about human and animal fertility.
So it was partly a joke, partly a prayer.
Exactly that mix. Communal joking and letting off steam, combined with a deep-seated superstitious belief that this kind of celebratory, life-affirming, sometimes shocking behavior would bring good luck, encourage mating, and ensure abundance in the fields and in the community.
And phallic symbols weren't just paraded, they were carved, worn.
All of the above. We talked about the Shilana gigs carved onto churches. During festivals or folk rituals, villagers might wear masks of animals seen as virile goats, bulls, depictions of ancient gods associated with fertility, like Priapus with his enormous erection, still showed up in late medieval art, maybe as garden statues in noble estates or in frescoes.
And phallic races.
Yes, these playful contests are documented at some fairs. Men would stuff carrots or specially shaped bottles down the front of their hose to look like huge erections and then race each other. People wearing masks during festivals might make overtly suggestive gestures, maybe flipping up their codpieces. Picture the sheer visual impact of these festivals. The masks, the exaggerated costumes, the explicit symbols. It was a sensory overload designed to evoke laughter and celebrate life.
Did this bawdiness show up in plays or songs, too?
Definitely. While the big religious mystery plays telling Bible stories were mostly solemn, the shorter plays or interludes performed between acts, sometimes called sauté chansons, fool songs, or farces, often contained plenty of sexual humor and social satire.
What about traveling entertainers? Bards.
They'd sing popular tales, often quite licentious ones, stories of clever wives tricking foolish husbands, gallants swapping lovers, cross-dressing jokes where women disguised as knights might kiss other ladies, naughty fairy tales. There's even a medieval Latin textbook that gives instructions to minstrels on specific bawdy verses suitable for performing in caverns after people had heard their sermons.
Mummer plays, too.
Surviving folk plays, like mummer plays performed at certain times of year, often include stock characters and scenes involving chases, mock seductions, death and resurrection themes, all with undertones of fertility and life cycles. Even church sermons sometimes made humorous, if indirect, references to lusty Old Testament stories, like David and Bathsheba, knowing it would get a reaction. And of course, major literature, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, is absolutely packed with sharp, witty, and often very crude sexual humor aimed at every level of society. Can you recall a specific type of medieval entertainment, beyond just simple jokes, that featured explicit sexual humor? Perhaps those fabliaux.
Were many of these customs rooted in older, pre-Christian traditions?
Many clearly were remnants of pagan beliefs and practices, especially those linking sex to nature and fertility.
Like beliefs about the moon?
Yes, some people strongly believe the moon influenced fertility. Conceiving under a full moon, or during specific months like May when nature was burgeoning, was thought to bring special luck or affect the child's temperament.
Were there sacred sites for fertility?
In some regions, yes. In parts of Germany, there were traditions of young couples secretly going to sleep together on certain sacred hills or near holy wells, particularly on May 1st, Walpurgisnacht, believing it would help them conceive strong, healthy children. In some Slavic areas, unmarried women performed rituals at spring festivals, singing to the fields, perhaps asking for lovers, sometimes throwing decorated eggs as a fertility charm.
How did the church deal with these?
Often through adaptation or tolerance, if they couldn't stamp them out. They might try to graft Christian saints or feast days onto existing pagan festival dates. A hymn originally sung to a fertility goddess might be rewritten as a hymn to the Virgin Mary. But the deep-rooted folk associations between sex, nature, and the cycles of life remain incredibly strong in popular belief.
Did people link sex to the seasons, too?
Very strongly. Winter was often seen as a dormant, safe time, maybe less sex due to the cold and hardship. Summer was the hot time, when desire flowed more freely, mirroring nature's abundance.
Any weird beliefs about sex affecting the weather?
There were some folk beliefs connecting the two. Just as witches were sometimes accused of using sex acts and rituals to cause storms, some folk practices involved couples making love under a blanket outdoors, hoping to magically induce rain during a drought, or perhaps stop excessive rain. A kind of sympathetic magic.
And timing conception by season or moon phase?
Yes. Some thought a baby conceived in the springtime would naturally have a lively, springy temperament, or that the phase of the moon could speed up or slow down labor. Anything related to natural cycles, the moon, the harvest, the winds, often acquired a superstitious sexual twist in folklore. You even find medieval agricultural calendars occasionally advising farmers on the best astrological times to marry, not just for their own children, but implying it would also ensure healthy crops.
It's incredible how deeply ingrained sexual themes were in medieval popular culture, rituals, and even agricultural advice. These weren't just isolated jokes, they were communal expressions of life, fertility, and a very human understanding of the world, often sidestepping official doctrines with a laugh and a dance.
Here's what stuck with me from this chapter. Quick flashcard mode from popular culture. Festivals like Carnival often functioned as thinly veiled pagan fertility rites, complete with parades of phallic symbols and bawdy songs. Explicit phallic imagery wasn't just in parades. It appeared in medieval art, from carvings on churches, Sheila gigs, to hidden manuscript margins. Theater, songs, and popular stories, like the fabliaux or interludes in plays, frequently and openly explored sexual humor and satire. Many folk beliefs, likely remnants of pagan traditions, directly link sex and fertility to natural cycles, like the phases of the moon or sacred times of year. Folk beliefs even connected sexual activity to the seasons, agricultural success, and sometimes even attempts to magically influence the weather.
All right, for our final section, let's wrap up our journey by looking at some of the most truly bizarre, unsettling, and strangest sexual beliefs and practices from the Middle Ages. This is where fear, superstition, and the absolute outer limits of the medieval imagination seem to converge, giving rise to ideas that are, well, both chilling and utterly fascinating. Hashtag TagTag14. The weirdest, strangest sexual beliefs or practices.
Perhaps the most widespread and chilling belief was in sexual encounters with demons, specifically incubi and succubi.
Humans that prey on sleepers.
Exactly. The succubus was believed to be a female demon who could seduce a sleeping man, often stealing his semen. Then, an incubus, the male counterpart, could supposedly take that stolen semen and use it to impregnate a sleeping woman.
So that's how they explain things like unexpected pregnancies or taboo conceptions.
It was one common explanation, yes. By the late Middle Ages, especially with the rise of demonology and witch hunts, books like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum explicitly taught that erotic dreams, especially those experienced by perceived sinners or suspected witches, could actually be sexual attacks by devils in disguise.
Did people try to protect themselves?
Yes, there were rituals. Drawing magical protective circles around the beds of nuns or holy virgins was believed to ward off these demonic sexual assaults.
Incubi and succubi, that's some serious nightmare fuel. It just shows how deep the fear of uncontrollable desire ran. And this fed into witch trials.
Directly. Accusations of having sex with the devil, often described in grotesque detail, became a standard feature of many witch trials. Beyond demons, there were also folk tales about other spirits, like elves or fairies, causing uncontrollable sexual frenzy or leading people astray. These supernatural explanations really represent the medieval mind grappling with powerful lust or desires they couldn't otherwise explain or accept.
What about sex magic? Was that a real thing?
It existed, but mostly in very fringe occult circles, or among certain scholars dabbling in esoteric beliefs. It wasn't mainstream at all.
What kind of practices?
You hear whispers of rites like hieros gamos, meaning sacred marriage. This involved a ritualized sexual union, sometimes between a priest and priestess figure, believed to generate cosmic power or achieve spiritual enlightenment. Some heretical groups, like factions of the Cathars in the 12th and 13th centuries, were accused of practicing versions of this, though often these accusations came from their enemies.
Alchemy had sexual symbolism too.
Yes, alchemical texts often use the language of sexual union, the marriage of King Sun and Queen Moon, for instance, to describe the combination of chemical substances. And mystical religious texts sometimes use surprisingly erotic symbolism, like depicting angels as passionate couples, to try and convey the intensity of divine love. But again, this was mostly confined to specific mystical or occult traditions.
The accusations in witch trials got really bizarre, didn't they? Sex with the devil.
Some of the wildest, most extreme sexual sins imaginable were thrown around in witchcraft and heresy trials. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Witch Hunter's Handbook, is full of lurid stories. Witches having painful, cold intercourse with demons, women allegedly having sex with animals like goats in demonic rituals, tales of entire brothels staffed by goats.
Lesbian covens, female priests.
Those accusations appear in some trial records too, often linked to heresy or devil worship. But we have to be extremely cautious about taking these literally.
Because they were extracted under torture.
Almost certainly in many cases.
Right.
These sensational accusations likely reflect the fears, anxieties, and perverse imaginations of the accusers and interrogators far more than any reality of what the accused actually did. But they do show the extreme places the medieval imagination could go when dealing with perceived threats and forbidden sexuality. Considering the role of torture in medieval trials, how might the accused confessions about sex with the devil reflect the fears of the accusers more than the actual actions of the accused?
Did saints get involved with sex-related issues? Relics?
Yes, in a way. Just as there were saints for other ailments, some became associated with sexual problems or fertility.
A sacred phallus relic. Seriously.
There's a rather colorful medieval tale, yes, about a French knight who, after some misadventure in a brothel, apparently prayed before a relic that turned out to be a sacred phallus, which miraculously cured him of some affliction. Likely just a legend, but it shows the blending of folk belief and religion.
Any real saints associated with this?
Well, nuns sometimes venerated Saint Guanfort, who was actually a dog, a greyhound, believing this dog saint offered protection to breastfeeding mothers and women during childbirth, so related to reproduction, if not sex directly. More conventionally, Joseph and Mary were held up as the ideal holy married couple for ordinary people to emulate. And specific holy wells, often associated with female saints like St. Anne, Mary's mother, or St. Bridget, became popular pilgrimage sites for couples praying for fertility or conception.
Could you pray for specific sexual favors?
Apparently so. There are records of prayers asking saints for help conceiving a child of a specific gender, usually a boy, or for healing from sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea, or for restoring potency. Imagine a weary couple, perhaps struggling to conceive, making a pilgrimage to a holy well, bringing a small offering, and whispering a prayer to St. Anne for the miracle of a child. It's a blend of deep faith and desperate hope.
What about nudity? Were there free love sex?
True free love communities practicing nudity and communal sex were extremely rare and considered radically heretical.
Like the Adamites?
Yes, that's the main example. A fringe group, primarily in Bohemia in the 15th century, who tried to live in nude communes, believing they were returning to the innocence of Eden before the fall. They were violently suppressed. Mainstream medieval society absolutely insisted on modesty in dress and behavior.
So nudity was very restricted.
Generally confined to very specific contexts, maybe medical examinations where a doctor might need to see a patient's body, artists might use models perhaps,
Yeah.
and within the privacy of marriage, presumably. But public or casual nudity was taboo.
And finally, animal trials for sex crimes. That actually happened.
Bizarrely, yes. Animals were sometimes put on formal trial for perceived crimes, including sexual ones.
Example.
A pig that injured or was believed to have sexually assaulted a child, or maybe a dog that attacked a nun, the animal could literally be arrested, put on trial, sometimes with legal representation, found guilty, and then publicly executed, often by hanging.
What if an animal was involved in human adultery?
There are strange cases where, say, if a woman was caught committing bestiality with a donkey in a rural area, the donkey might be executed while the woman received a lesser penalty or even went free, depending on the local laws and circumstances. It shows a really weird sense of justice. These trials were truly bizarre remnants of a worldview where every moral offense, every disruption of the natural or divine order, seemed to require formal judgment and punishment, extending even to the animal kingdom.
We've traversed the truly bizarre landscape of medieval sexual beliefs, from demons stealing semen to saints curing sexual woes and even animals standing trial. It's a powerful testament to how medieval people grappled with the unexplainable, the frightening, and the deeply human, often through the lens of the supernatural.
It's a lot to say. Quick flashcard mode for the truly weird bits. Widespread belief in incubi and succubi sex demons was used to explain uncontrollable lust, wet dreams, and even unexpected pregnancies. Fringe occult practices sometimes involve sex magic rituals like Heroes Gamos, or used erotic symbolism in mystical or alchemical texts. Witchcraft trials featured incredibly bizarre and likely torture-induced accusations of sex with the devil, demons in animal form, or participation in orgies. People prayed to specific saints or visited holy wells seeking cures for sexual maladies, help with fertility, or even conception of a desired gender. Relics were sometimes involved. True free love, sex practicing nudity were extremely rare and heretical, like the Adamites. Mainstream society enforced strict modesty. In a truly bizarre legal quirk, animals were sometimes formally put on trial and even executed for perceived sex crimes or involvement in human sexual acts.
That's all for now. We've come to the end of our gentle little story for tonight, and if you're still here, that's perfectly okay. Sometimes your mind just needs a little more space to wander, and that's a tender, beautiful thing. You don't have to rush off to sleep. Just be here however you are. You deserve quiet moments like this. You deserve to rest, to be held by stillness. There's no pressure, no expectations, just soft breathing, gentle thoughts, and the hush of night. The world is a softer place with you in it. Good night, truly. Just listen to the rain sounds now.